So I'm going to put my best teacher voice on now, and I'm going to stare at you. There we go. No, I'm going to... Listen, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming along today, taking time out of the busy schedule. I know there's loads of really exciting events on today, so it's lovely to see so many of you here for hours. We thought we'd start a few minutes late because one of our guests is stuck in that massive security... Hands up if you've been through the massive security queue this morning. Yeah. One of our guests is going to join us, Moynihan from Harris Federation, but we thought we'd get started now in order that we can try and largely run to time. Dame Rachel's got to nip out a little bit early, so she gets up and goes. It's nothing... Well, I'm told it's nothing personal. Again. Okay, so listen, enough from me. What I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce each of the guests in turn with a brief introduction, and then we're going to get straight stuck in. But what I hope, as a former teacher and head teacher, I want to tell you now what I want you to walk out of here maybe understanding better or knowing a little bit more about is the three key questions we're going to grapple with, which is how have things got better for our young people since 2010, and indeed since before then? What things have maybe got more challenging since then? And what do we need to focus on next? What do we need to be really focusing on maybe over the next 12 months? What needs to go into the manifesto in order to make things for our young people even better going forward? So first one, I'm going to ask Dame Rachel de Souza. Lots of you will know Dame Rachel de Souza already, but she's a former head teacher, former leader of the Inspiration Trust group of schools, and now the Children's Commissioner for England. So Dame Rachel.
So this is just a brief introduction because we want to really spend our time on the questions. But I was a head teacher and teacher for 32 years. I was at the forefront of the reform movement from basically, I was a sponsored academy principal, one of the first ones under Tony Blair, then worked through with Michael Gove and the government in terms of both setting up free schools, doing turnaround academies, and I ran a group of schools. I became Children's Commissioner in 2021, and the golden thread really is that I believe passionately that the most whatever background a child's from, the most disadvantaged background deserve the absolute best education and can achieve the best outcomes as long as we put the support in. Now, one thing I would say really quickly as Children's Commissioner, when I came into role, I did a big survey called the Big Ask. Biggest response in the world of a child survey, 500,000 responses from everywhere, children of every background. And I just want to start by saying the children of this country are incredibly optimistic. You often hear all the problems, and we can rehearse them, and I'm sure we will. But when I ask them, are you going to be richer than your parents? Every single hand goes up. When I ask them, have you got a plan? They've got plans, they've got dreams, they've got passions, and they're prepared to work hard and roll their sleeves up. That came through really loud and clear. They absolutely see education as key to their future. Their number one priority is great job. They see education as key. But if there's something shouting from those 500,000 responses, it's support, support, support. Help us get there. So I'm really looking forward to the debate today, and I'll hand over.
Yeah, so if I can introduce, hopefully you'll all recognise and know this great guy, the Right Honourable Kit Malthouse MP. I particularly wanted Kit to come along here today, not just because he was, albeit briefly, Secretary of State for Education, but because all the other roles he's had across different stages of government in his career so far. So, Kit, over to you.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, no, that's kind of you, but I was Education Secretary fleetingly, but I'd spent much of my career in crime and policing and in social services thinking about young people. So it was great to accept your invitation. I think there are a couple of things to say about your questions. I mean, first of all, have things got better for young people? Undoubtedly, yes. When I got to DfE, I set the team the objective that when the electorate walks through to the ballot box, whenever the election comes, second Thursday of October next year, when they walk in, the one thing they think when they walk in, what have the Tories done over the last 10 or 15 that has been really good? The one thing that they would think would be education, because on every metric, things have got better. Numeracy, literacy, the international league tables, you all know the story. But in truth, while lots has been done, there's still a lot more to do, and I wanted just to raise a few things, if I may. First, I think there are three things with schools in particular. First of all, there is still a battle for standards to be won. We've still got hundreds of thousands of kids being educated in RRI schools. One of the numbers that we identified at DfE to drive down was that 700,000 that are still being educated there. And the notion of the DfE stepping in much more assertively with local education authorities or MATs to deal with those issues on an active basis. The new regional structure of the department allows that to happen much more coherently. But to ask a simple question really, which is when a school gets an inspection downgrade, why does it come as a surprise? Why does the LEA not know? Why does the MAT not know? Why is somebody not identifying and monitoring and saying, do you know what, next time they show up, we're in big trouble here, we need to sort it out. And so forcing them to be on the front foot. The second issue is attendance and behaviour. Attendance has improved recently. I had a look at the numbers from last week. Fortunately now, you know, we've got 85% of schools. It's one of the benefits of the pandemic. 85% of schools reporting in on a daily basis. Absence about 5% at the moment. 2.9% authorised, 2.1 unauthorised. Not that bad, but hidden in the numbers, there are some very persistent non-attenders. And in truth, if you look at the attendance structure, it is a mess. Fines, possibly. I think we've got 3 kinds of orders. There's contracts. None of it is, in my former life, in crime and justice, what you would call swift and certain. And so one of the things I'd like to see in the manifesto is a revamp and a reform of the attendance structure so that parents know where they stand, there's some rigour and discipline, swift and certain, and then we get the kids back into school. And then again, on behaviour, where we've seen a significant deterioration in behaviour since the pandemic, with something, I think was a survey this summer, something like 40% of pupils saying that behaviour of their is making them sometimes fear for
the
themselves.
National Behaviour Survey.
Yeah, exactly, National Behaviour Survey, that's right. And there, I worry slightly that we put too much on schools and not enough on parents. And similarly with attendance, we need to reassert the notion of parental responsibility for both. Very often we say it's the school's problem and they've got to have mentors and support mechanisms and all that kind of stuff, whereas actually very often the problem sits at home. So I think we need to think about that. And then the third thing is the growing schism in education between, I guess, what you would call the majority of progressive education and then the growing number of, I don't know what you'd call it, reform, traditional, rigorous education. You know, you've got Dixon's Trinity, King Solomon, a few of those, Mercius Harris, who are going for a much more rigorous, knowledge-based discipline approach, getting some great results across the country, admittedly facing quite a lot of hostility from the education establishment, although that seems to be softening. But I think that's a schism that's going to need to be addressed at some point as well. And then the other area that we should talk about really is the social care side, because you know, you're asking if things are getting better for children. Well, they are for some, but for a minority, they are not necessarily. As Rachel will know, we've seen in the papers, haven't we, some real horror stories coming through in children's social care. And it became clear to me over the last few years that we need to question whether we've set the bar too high for family intervention. Right. It sounds a hard thing to say, that we're not possibly intervening soon enough, or indeed, horrible though it might sound, taking enough children away. But I've often pondered this notion that we blame the care system for the outcome of children who go through it, the looked after children system. But in fact, most kids that are going into that system go into it deeply damaged before they even get there. And then the system struggles to try and get them back onto a path of brightness. And so I think there's a real challenge for us about where that bar is set, and it's a very tough debate to have. In amongst that, sorry, this is a long thing because I've got a lot to get on my chest. I do think we need to look at the Children's Act. We haven't had an updated Children's Act for some time. Most of it is based off the 1930s Children's Act. It still has offences like allowing a child to be burnt, which is from when we put them up chimneys. We haven't updated it for the advent of social media, the impact on kids' lives, what notions of child cruelty means, you know, all those kind of things. You can give your kids booze at home. There's all sorts of stuff you can do that comes from a Victorian era when the government didn't have the kind of safeguarding bent that we have now, that I think needs to be looked at. And then finally, for me, I'd love to see a huge public health education strategy around attachment theory. All of the problems that we deal with in later life, particularly in crime and justice, come from very poor attachments formed in early age. We talk about smoking during pregnancy, drinking during pregnancy. We talk about all sorts of things to do with nutrition, and parents should look after their kids and feed them, but we never talk about the psychological aspects of parenting and about forming strong attachments with your kids.
And now we've got Rachel Sylvester, Times columnist, but I was particularly delighted she could join us today because you helped pull together the Times Education Commission, whose report came out last year. Most importantly, it's got a beautiful photo of my oldest daughter in it, because she was at Bedford Free School. But I thought it was really important to have someone from the Times Education Commission here today, because I think your recommendations were quite different to what maybe someone like myself or Rachel would have necessarily come up with, and I think it's really important that we keep that discussion going on in schools. So Rachel, over to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention a few statistics as a bit of a reality check, really. So 1 in 4 young people are suffering from a probable mental health disorder. A third of children effectively fail all their GCSEs at 16. Disadvantaged pupils are 18 months behind their wealthier peers at 16. And to me, one of the most shocking things, 40% of that gap emerges before they even get to school. Nearly a third of 5-year-olds are not reaching a good level of development at the age of 5. 2/3 of parents think the education system isn't preparing their children properly for either life or work. We've had 5 education secretaries in a year, not to diminish anything that any of the individuals have done, particularly Kit, but you know, that is just not serious. And 1%, because this is a party political event, 1% of 18 to 14-year-olds, 18 to 24-year-olds, according to one poll last week, plan to vote Conservative. So I think there is something really serious. Obviously, lots of brilliant things have happened in education. The reforms that Michael Gove introduced in particular really did make a difference. But to be totally honest, reform has stalled for a decade. There hasn't been enough, and many of these problems have developed and got worse ever since, despite the brilliant efforts of people like Dan Moynihan and Harris Federation and Bedford Free School and other really excellent schools. So on the Times Education Commission, there were 2 or 3 things I'd like to highlight very briefly that we suggested. I'm really pleased that Rishi Sunak seems likely to be weighing in behind the idea of a British Baccalaureate, which we recommended as a way of creating much more breadth as well as rigour in the education system up to 18. So you could do a mixture in our version of humanities and sciences, but also vocational and academic, and ending that kind of sheep and goats divide. We argued that that should start much younger, so you'd have a slimmed down set of exams at 16. And I think you need to think much more broadly about the whole curriculum and assessment system rather than just piling an extra layer on top. And you know, we heard repeatedly that employers have lost faith in the current assessment system. 3/4 of companies ask their applicants to sit online aptitude tests, and 1 in 7 give absolutely no notice at all to the kind of formal qualifications. And we heard from people like James Dyson that the education system, if we want to create the entrepreneurs of the future, we need much more creativity. That's not dumbing down, that's giving children the skills they need for the workplace that is there now. More digital skills, more ability to interrogate the knowledge, not just learning facts, actually interrogating the information that they receive so that they know how to read things online, they understand how to read a graph. They're not going to be bamboozled by fake news. The other point I think is so important, where I agree with Kit, is the importance of those early years. And that there has been underinvestment in that. I went to Estonia, where they have the best outcomes, educational outcomes in the OECD. They said education is like a tree. You have to start with the roots, and you have to make the roots solid. And that does involve attachment, as Kit said, but making nursery education, early years education, about education, not just childcare, so that it isn't just a babysitting service. We're really taking that opportunity to level the playing field to make sure every single child has the best chance in life. So I'm really pleased to be here and very happy to discuss any of that.
Thanks, Rachel. And last but by no means least, I'm delighted to introduce one of my heroes, Sir Dan Moynihan of Harris Federation. Dan has been absolutely at the front line of transforming young people's lives for a long time now, and if more schools were run in the way that Harris Federation was run, we wouldn't probably be having this discussion today, because kids would be in a better place. He's had a bit of a nightmare getting in this morning. Thank you so much for being here, Dan. Over to you.
Pleasure. What was the brief other than
Quick
you've said?
introduction.
What was the question this morning?
So the question is, what's got better since 2010 and what are the challenges?
Okay, so lots has got better. Clearly, more children are able to read, and the emphasis on phonics that was put forward by Nick Gibb has been really significant. Reading is better. More kids are likely to be in a good or outstanding school than in 2010, and that's something to celebrate. I think it's gone up from 68 to 88% that are good or outstanding schools. it's more likely that if you're in a failing school, that failure will be addressed by academy conversion. And there's a quasi-market operating in the system now. So instead of schools languishing for decades, failing, there's a possibility that an academy group will be able to take it over. If that academy group doesn't do well with it, somebody else will take it over. It's not a perfect system, but it is better than what existed before. In our group, we have many schools that failed on multiple occasions, and now there's a solution for that. There's a greater emphasis on subject knowledge, and there are more kids studying maths and sciences and history and geography. That must be good. But there are also lots of problems, and you know, the different performance of different ethnic groups. We all know that Black Caribbean youngsters have underperformed. They don't underperform at Harris, but nationally that's an issue. But an even bigger group is white working class students, low income white working class students. We don't talk about them. Why is that? They're one of the lowest achieving groups in the country. And that's reflected in the regional divide, where you find lower performance in the north. For me, any government worth the title, whichever colour it is, would be addressing that head on and having a national debate about what we're going to do with the underachievement of some key groups that do really, really badly. And it will have political consequences if we don't deal with it. We find in our schools that we deal more and more with services that really aren't our business. So on ITN 2 weeks ago, one of our schools was featured where 50% of the families are homeless, and the head and her staff spend no end of time trying to get people into accommodation night by night and provide them food from a food bank because they don't have cooking facilities. We're seeing more and more of that in our schools. There's a polarisation in society, and we can't access council services in many cases. You've heard there's a growing problem with mental health. There are all sorts of possible reasons for that, but it's a real problem. In some of the boroughs we operate in, children have to wait for 1 or 2 years to access mental health support. We've created an internal team of mental health specialists, 5 people, but it isn't enough when you've got 44,000 youngsters, and last year we had 1,707 cases of mental health difficulties that really did need assistance. So somebody needs to do something about the structure and the resourcing of provision for mental health in local authorities and also for special needs. They're stretched to hell, they can't deliver. It's not just about money, it's about money and reform. A government needs to have a plan for that. And, you know, we all remember Theresa May's election, where the funding cuts in education cut through to the electorate and it reduced her majority. You know, this is an easy target, and you can see it coming, the attack lines, in terms of the problems with the support services that work for the most disadvantaged kids around the country. It's becoming a crisis, and that coupled with persistent absence. So what's the strategy to tackle persistent absence? 1.7% of all children, 1.7% of all children have 50% or more absence. Now, we know that 2% of all kids will one day end up in the criminal justice system. 9% of persistently absent children will be. What are we going to do about that? Some of the areas we operate in, gang and knife crime is endemic. Endemic. We don't hear much about it other than we see the faces on the television of the latest kid who's been stabbed. Now, I have to say, if this was in Surrey, we'd be seeing that and we'd be hearing about it. We're not seeing and hearing about it when it's in Southwark or Croydon. So what's the strategy to tackle knife crime? We see outside our schools the same youths coming who have already been arrested for possession of a knife, and they're back. Where's the stop and search? There's no problem amongst our parents with stop and search. They want their children to come home safely. They want to know there's a police presence, but there isn't. And those are the key issues for me. And of course, the disadvantage gap is a perennial problem and hasn't closed. The difference between the attainment of children eligible for free school meals and those who are not. That clearly is a criminal waste of talent. And if we're going to be a country that competes with the best in the world, we can't be writing off a large section of our population, whether they're from particular ethnic minorities or whether they're of low income. To be a competitor, we need talent from wherever it comes. The purpose of the education system, surely, is to unlock that talent. But we now need more than education. We need the other services as well. And somebody needs to find a solution to that in policy terms rather than ignore it. That's my rant.
Well, thank you, Dan. Okay, so the first bit of the discussion we're going to have is around the stuff that's got better. Let's focus on the positive to start off with. Why was it able to get better the way it did? Bearing in mind, especially, we know things have picked up since 2010, and money was tight. Like, education was protected relative to other public services, but money was undoubtedly tight. And yet, for a long time, things got better. So what were the conditions that enabled the improvement we've seen to happen? I'm going to start off with Kit, if that's all right.
Well, in my long and some may say mediocre career, where I've seen significant improvement in public services is largely because you've got one driven individual who really pushes it from the centre. If you've got a minister, a secretary of state, head of a multi-academy trust, children's committee, whatever it might be, if you get somebody who is unrelenting and demanding at the centre, really often that's the only time you get change or significant advancement and change. I think Rachel is right. Continuity makes a big difference too, and we've obviously seen with the schools minister over the last 10 years with Nick Gibb that massive change. Not least the battle he had to fight over phonics. Extraordinary battle there that he had to fight.
So I've just come in. Is that your experience, Rachel, from the front line?
So yes, but I think I would say more, because you need that person to drive, and we saw, I think Dan and I both experienced as young academy principals in the Blair days, with Andrew Jonas, that then picked up by Gove, who put his foot on the gas. So you need that individual, but you also need to build capacity, and it's not enough just to have like one person driving it and it all collapses. So for me, I think schools, I became a head teacher, a sponsored academy principal in 2005, and I can tell you schools are unrecognisable now. They are unrecognisably better. We forget that. The places I used to go, the schools I saw, were just in any normal town. We are unrecognisably better, and I think we were absolutely motoring before the pandemic. There were problems, there were concerns with mental health, there were all the concerns that have been raised, but the attainment gap was narrowing and the capacity building was happening. So when I was a Blair Academy principal, I was number 67. Yeah, there were only 200 of us by the time, but then that grew exponentially, and we've got Leora sitting here with CST. People started to codify, get the evidence base, but most importantly, we realised that we could do it, that just because your postcode was not your destiny, and if you were in some of my early academies in the old Halliard High School in Luton that became Barnfield West, it had been the bottom of the league tables for 20 years. Parents and grandparents picketed outside of it. Dan will be able to tell you these stories too. And in 2 or 3 years, we turned it round with ridiculous mammoth efforts and lots of support, but we got the outcomes. Now that became a far more widespread expectation. So by the pandemic, the gap was narrowing. There was a far greater evidence base in terms of the subject base, whatever you were. Secretaries of State might have changed, but everybody was on a mission going down the motorway, in the same way. When I started with Blair and Gove, it was let's make great head teachers. By the time we got to the pandemic, it was let's make great trusts. And there was that realisation that collaboration could do it, and we were starting to think about this wider things. Now the problem is the pandemic came. And I think we now are in a position where we came out of the pandemic, and the attendance figures were as bad as they are today. The mental health figures, I went and did the figure, the mental health figures are as bad coming out of the pandemic as they are today. There's been minimal impact on the serious problems that we're talking about, and the attainment gap has blown apart. So for me, what needs to happen is that we need to grapple with, we need to do twice as much as we did before and look at those wider issues. I never thought I'd be sitting with Dan talking about mental health, knife crime and homelessness. You know, our early focus was on standards, what we could do, what we could achieve ourselves. Now we need to build a system to be able to deal with these different problems. We don't need, it's like we don't really need a new framework, we don't need a new curriculum, all that's done. What we need is how are we going to harness the, you know, the things that LAs are meant to be delivering, how can we work together, collaborate and actually deliver a real response for our children. And I can tell you, I was in a trust, you know, out in Norfolk, leading my trust in Norfolk and Suffolk during the pandemic. Who delivered the beds? Who did the food banks? Who was checking on children who were at risk of abuse? It was my caretaker, my teachers, our schools. We've proven ourselves so that when I did the family review, nationally representative adults in this country said the two places they trusted were schools and their GP. Still. So we have the possibility of making the change, but we've got to go at it. And if we do the same, we're going to end up where we are now, which is still 1 million children not coming to school 1 day a week, still the 100,000 missing, and you know the problems that we've talked about, homelessness, mental health problems, right across the piece. We've got to harness our passion for reform, do it again, do it better, and do it more intelligently, picking up all these issues that are now more widely found.
Don't you think there was a political agreement cross-party on the importance of reform and actually the shape of reform, and it was a priority?
Yeah.
So Tony Blair said education, education, education. Michael Gove came in as Education Secretary, followed on very much from, he expanded the Academy and Free School programme, but it was very much in the same direction. So there was a sort of consistency across governments. It wasn't a political football, it wasn't an ideological disagreement. I remember Cameron voting for Blair's reforms, and that was a big moment. There was a sort of, it was above politics, and that meant you could have over a time period that was going to make a difference. But since then, since 2010, the budget for the NHS has gone up 42%, budget for schools 3%, you know, and it's just slipped down the Westminster agenda, and nobody seems to really care about it.
So I'm just going to come to Dan. Dan, how have you been able to build the capacity? Because Rachel talked about we had the capacity, you know, you guys had the capacity to grow the pipeline. How have you been able to do that in Harris, given all the other challenges?
I mean, just going back to why was it a success initially, clearly the government elected in 2010 had a plan.
Yeah.
And they'd been planning in opposition for some years. And what was special about Michael Gove, I think, as a Conservative that wrong-footed people was, he always talked about, it was a kind of one-nation conservatism, he always talked about disadvantage and inequality. And if you look back at his speeches, every speech hits that. But we haven't had that, I think, since. And that clarity is what we need to have. I mean, how we've built capacity is simply we've built it internally. As the group has grown, we've developed our own leaders. 85% of our heads are homegrown. They know the Harris DNA. And, you know, our objective is we see ourselves as a force for social mobility. Whether we are or not is for other people to judge. But we're uncompromising. If we take on a failing school, we know precisely what we need to do. And those children are going nowhere without qualifications in their hands. Bottom line, they don't look like or sound like anyone who's going to interview them. They have to have qualifications, pucker qualifications, and our purpose is to get them as quickly as possible. And you know, I'd like to give you a clever answer, but I haven't got one. That's the truth.
Right, so following on from that then, we've tried to do the positive stuff, because I still think when I talk amongst people in and around the government, they don't quite appreciate how many successes we have had in education. And I think it's because the challenges are the things at the most forefront in our minds. So I'm going to come to each of you in turn now, picking just one of those challenges, please. Can you pick the biggest challenge you can think of and what you think possibly we could be working on as a sector that maybe we're not doing yet? I know it's a massive ask because there's so many, but if you can just pick one thing you think is really important. And I'll come to you first if it's okay, Rachel.
Okay, your point about reform, I think it is like a shark. If you stop swimming, you die. And the problem is it's stalled. It's not that the reforms that were there have not worked, but it's you have to keep going.
Keep driving.
And I think the next step is this kind of assessment and curriculum to make the system more relevant and broader, so that you and I think Rishi Sunak, we read, is going to be talking about possibly even this week that sort of next stage of the evolution, revolution, because you have to make. Dan's absolutely right. Children need qualifications, but they have to be qualifications that the employers want. They have to be qualifications that are relevant to life and work. And the curriculum has to keep up with the modern world. And the evidence that we heard from a massive range of people on the Health Commission, business leaders, scientists, cultural figures, artists, teachers, parents, was that it isn't. I remember one head teacher we had a round table in Cornwall at the Eden Project actually, and she just said, we're preparing children for a world that doesn't exist. And there's then within that, I think that doesn't help with the mental health problems because children don't quite understand the point of what they're learning. So there's a way in which, and the criticism of that is that's, you know, dumbing down or eroding standards. I'd say completely the opposite. It has to be really high standard, really high quality, really excellent. You look at the International Baccalaureate, which is taught by some schools. That is at least, you know, even more respected by the universities, but also by employers than the A-levels and GCSEs. So I think if you're talking about, I picked one subject, I could have picked a dozen others, but I would say
so the curriculum assessments
that would be the next step of reform.
Okay. Can we turn to you now, Dame Rachel? Would you...
So I want to say, this might be a bit challenging, but I want to see grip. I want to see government get a grip. I want to see the civil service get a grip of how they're running these services, because I am up in Westminster and I can see it with all. With change that you know, okay, it's happened, but I just don't feel there is that sense of grip and direction that we need to actually get us out of the problems. A really good example locally, of course, for me, number one, I really want children to be able to be back at school and to solve the attendance crisis. So I've been doing, this summer did regional, we've done a lot of research, got the evidence base, but we went and did regional roundtables in the 3 local authorities where attendance was the worst. And we pulled together heads of the NHS, chief execs, police commissioners, high level, and you know, for many of them, it was the first time they'd met each other. Now, how can it be that I am in an attendance alliance at national level, and yet I'm going to regional areas, and the people who are responsible for delivery of you know, the services for children have barely met each other and certainly not seen the attendance data. As soon as I illuminated them, I mean, the ICB members, the health members were like, God, this is a crisis. So I think I need national government and civil service to get a grip on the regional and deliver for our, you know, make sure delivery is happening for our young people. The people who will do it are the people on the ground. They're the heroes. They're the ones who are truly doing reform and turning things around and bringing things together. But it needs to be guided to have a plan. And I think, you know, I just say that word to you, grip. We need to see more grip.
Kit, as a politician?
Yeah, well, I agree, and that speaks to my first answer, which is about the centre really with energy driving the agenda forward. I mean, I hear what Rachel says about the curriculum. At this stage, I'm not completely convinced because I don't think the job yet is finished on getting the kind of basic foundation right. So for me, the big 5, attendance, behaviour, reading, writing, maths, making sure that is universally great provision, a solid foundation for everybody across the country, I think is a kind of critical thing. And to be honest with you, I sometimes worry that we're fooling ourselves, particularly with the inspection regime. I got into a lot of trouble last year for saying that there were too many people hanging on to mediocrity, and I worry slightly that we're kind of satisfied with good for too many schools. When I was policing minister, we had a similar inspection regime, and I introduced a 5th in the middle. I wanted to call it mediocre, but the department persuaded me to call it adequate. And guess where most police forces fell? Right? Having been good, they fell into adequate. So you know, the job of the DFE is both to assist and support and fund, but also to challenge. And I worry often that ministers and secretaries of state in all departments actually put themselves in a position of as if they're running the school, rather than being the representative of the parents and the kids, and challenging. And we saw from last year, when you do say challenging things, you get a lot of pushback. And so drive, courage, willingness to say uncomfortable things and push the system, I think, is the biggest challenge for us at the moment, because the job isn't done.
Yeah,
Thank you. I'm going to come to Dan in a minute, but I'm aware that Dame Rachel's got to go in a minute. So does anyone have any questions that they want to particularly point to? Oh gosh, you're very popular, Dame Rachel. We'll probably only manage one question, so I'm going to go to...
Thank you. So thank you for today. So as Mark knows, so I'm Dr. Souza King, I'm an associate professor at the University of Birmingham. A lot of my research centres around relationships, sex and health education. However, my question today is to you is about child sexual abuse. So in my role, I was the lead for the Home Office funded National Sibling Sexual Abuse Project, in which we looked at all of the different components around specifically sibling sexual abuse.
Yep.
Myself and colleagues have produced a mapping tool for social services. And the more I look into this area, the more that I see it's a real underlying problem that's playing out on an educational, in the education arena.
Absolutely.
So we're thinking 1 in 5 young people are experiencing sibling sexual abuse. That means there's 2 children. There's one carrying out the harm, and there's one who have been harmed. So my question is, because it links very, very specifically to the underachievement, the mental health issues, the lack of attendance, is sibling sexual abuse being spoken about specifically in this arena, because it's a huge unspoken about problem that myself as an academic and other colleagues in the field are now starting to notice, you know, that it really is a huge issue, bigger than we ever thought.
Yeah, so I mean, my office does a lot of work on this and has done a lot of work around peer-on-peer abuse as well, and the related issues. I think it is spoken about around children's social care, and I think there is something that's really important when we're talking about coalescing around the child rather than silos of services, that we need to make sure everyone working with children has a really good understanding of both child sexual abuse, but also safeguarding. It's not just what to do, but it's also how to work with children you know, who've experienced this. And that's everyone from head teachers, right through to the services around. And that's why more and more I'm seeing the solutions, the solution to many of our problems, because even when you look at children in the criminal justice system, the kind of children, there's a lot of talk now where everyone's suddenly getting very excitable about, because of Eliane's death, it's knife crime, it's gangs, it's whatever. We also know, that it's children, there are children who won't have their personality disorders, confirmed till they're over 18, who have often been seriously abused, who are getting sucked into this. So I think a deep and profound understanding of child sexual abuse is incumbent on every professional working with children to have that. So it looks like you're going to be busy.
I mean, it also points to the issue I raised earlier about tolerance, right? So in those circumstances, I'm not sure there's necessarily much of a question asked about who knew, who didn't say anything, and where were social services and intervention, how much were they willing to tolerate before they actually did anything assertive. And I worry across the whole of children's social care that we've become far too standoffish, far too hesitant to intervene.
Yeah.
Because it's deemed to be, in my early years as an MP, I stood up in that house in a debate on adoption and fostering and said, my view was we didn't take enough children away. We were leaving them in homes to be terribly badly damaged and then taking them away once they'd been damaged and expecting to sort them out. And I got screamed down by people across the house because apparently that's an appalling thing to say. But actually what we're seeing across the pages of our newspapers and in your work is that lack of intervention at the right stage and early enough.
Thank you.
Could I get the issue for me?
Please do.
The issue for me goes before the other ones we've heard. It's foundational. There aren't enough teachers or good teachers in the system. So we need a proper strategy to develop and improve teacher supply. Now, we may hear one this week. That's a possibility. But there is a crisis in schools. I mean, we run really good schools in London. We've got good reputation. We pay more than average. We go once a year to Jamaica and we recruit 50 to 75 Jamaican teachers who are fantastic people. But we're having to do that because we cannot find teachers here. All teachers in all subjects are paid the same. Is there a case for paying physicists and computer scientists much more? We have national scales. You know, graduates are looking at their friends having flexible working. We can't offer that. Well, we can't offer it to the same level. What can we offer that makes teaching attractive? Where is a government programme that gives examples in advertising of the difference that teachers make? Salaries have reduced over time, and that's a real problem for teachers. So there is a crisis out there, and although schools may have teachers, sometimes they aren't the specialists that they want. Large numbers of maths and science teachers aren't necessarily qualified. They're doing the best job they can, but they're not necessarily graduates in their subjects. Is that what we want? And I know there's no money, and both parties will say there isn't much money and what can we do? But where you've got 93% of the population using a public service, it has to be fixed.
Thanks so much, Dan. Right, we're going to go to the questions now. We're going to have a lot of questions, I think. We've got about 12 minutes, and Dame Rachel's being beckoned. Thank you so much.
Sorry, thanks. Sorry.
Right. What I'll do is I'll get, if you can just please get straight to the question. So being the teacher, get straight to the question, not the ramble, and I'll take 2 or 3 questions at once if that's okay. So let's go to Alice. Can we go to the lady next to you?
Thank you, Karen Wright from Humanists UK. To be very short on the ramble, last year the government introduced legislation to shut down illegal schools. Will the government bring that back, and what do you think about that as a panel?
Thank you very much. And the lady just in front of Elizabeth.
Hello, my name is Laddie Smith. I'm President of the Royal College of Psychiatrists. I was very pleased to hear Rachel and Dan speaking about mental health. The reality is that 75% of mental health problems start in children and young people. And if we don't treat them, they become adults who have relapsing remitting disorders. The problem is this, that teachers are not psychiatrists, actually. And we know that teachers are, but what they can do is pick up and signpost children to mental health services. But as you said, Dan, the mental health services are not equipped because we are frankly chronically under-resourced. And in fact, the ambition is to treat 35% of children. That's unbelievable. And if it was leukemia, it would be 100%, obviously. The question is this, really, and it's probably for Kit. Is the government thinking of a long-term strategy around children's mental health? Because it's not simply about for health and well-being. These are the children who will become, if they're not treated, they won't achieve their potential, they won't become productive adults, we cannot be a prosperous country. So we can't afford not to do something about that. And I'd like to see something in the manifesto about a long-term strategy for children.
Thank you very much. Well, let's take one more. Can we go to the gentleman behind you, Alice? Yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much. My name's Arthur. I'm here from Magic Breakfast. We're a charity school breakfast provider that works on the premise that no child should be too hungry to learn. Another stat to kind of throw into the mix here is that since COVID, 1/4 of families with children are experiencing food insecurity. And we introduced, so the government runs a national school breakfast programme, and we introduced that under Theresa May. And there's a huge body of evidence that proves that it helps with attendance, behaviour, attainment, but it only reaches 1/4 of the schools that are eligible for it. You know, this is a policy that's about half of schools in England are eligible for this provision. Given the low cost behind it and given the benefits that the policy has, could this be something that the panel would like to see expanded on in the next manifesto for the Conservative Party? Thanks.
Thank you so much. Right, we'll just try and answer those questions now. So, I'll come to you, Kit, in terms of, do you think the government's thinking clearly about a mental health strategy for young people?
Well, so on all 3 questions, on illegal schools, I certainly hope so. The schools bill got abandoned for various reasons, but as I hope I've tried to indicate in my answers, I think we need a lot more rigour in the system about attendance and the type of school and the standard of behaviour and the standard of school and those illegal schools. Whatever guise they come under, we need to be tough about dealing with them. And there's lots of people who raise all sorts of libertarian objections about them. Fundamentally, if you're not turning out right-thinking citizens of this country. We should have something to say about it. On mental health, obviously I'm not a member of the government anymore, but I would certainly hope so. I have to say there is a challenge though, particularly in the SEN system, which is about the changes in the rules in 2014-15, when we suddenly saw a massive upsurge in kids coming into that bracket. Interestingly, they didn't change the rules in Wales, and the numbers have stayed broadly the same. And certainly the teachers I've talked to when I was at the department and since, there's quite an unspoken undercurrent that's saying, you know, there's quite a number of these kids who actually shouldn't be in that bracket. These are standard issues of behaviour that we could deal with in a standard way without them necessarily coming into this kind of medicalised bracket of needing assistance. That would clear away more space to deal with the more acute end, and I agree with you. There is a crisis in my own constituency. We've got people waiting 18 months, 2 years for some kind of assistance from CAMS, and it's a big one. They tell me there's a big reform programme, they're recruiting, but like everybody who's recruiting at the moment, teachers, police officers, whatever it might be, we're short of people. You know, we have an employment problem, we're full employment, too many inactive people. We need to try and close that gap, and Jeremy Hunt's talking about that today. I have to say, I do think part of it speaks to what I was saying earlier on about a kind of attachment approach to particularly early, very early years. I mean, I know Andrea Ledsam's been very good on the first 1,000 days, but you know, 3, 4, 5, 6, if you get it right then, you've pretty much set fair for the future. And so really talking to parents about their obligations, really, at that age towards their kids' mental health, not just physical health, which we don't do for some reason, seems to me critical to that too. And on Magic Breakfast, yeah, absolutely. I think the evidence is there. I don't know why the rollout has stalled or why those schools aren't applying to put it in a way, but they should be.
Dan, can I come to you? In terms of breakfast for kids, like, is there stuff going across Harris Federation in terms of feeding kids?
Yeah.
How have you funded it? How's that going?
The majority of our schools provide free breakfasts for youngsters, and it's also a thing that helps with attendance. So low-income kids are the most likely to be persistently absent. They're also the most likely to be hungry. So if you provide a breakfast, they're more likely to come in. And we also offer food in many of our schools in the evenings to get people to stay on for clubs.
And how are you finding the funding for that? How are you organising that? Is that just out of your core funding?
We fund that out of our core funding because for us it's a priority. Many of our children won't eat regularly unless we feed them. Particularly the kids I mentioned earlier who are homeless, they move from room to room sometimes each night, and they have no cooking facilities, so our schools will give them, I mean, it sounds terrible, but they'll give them like cheese sandwiches and fruit because you can't cook.
And Rachel,
It's shocking, isn't it?
I was going to say, the Commission had some stuff to say, didn't it, around the support for young people and mental health?
Yeah, just on this food point, you know, I'm now chairing a health commission for the Times, and one of the things that's really shocked me is you've got malnutrition soaring and obesity soaring, and it's this sort of appalling, you know, these Victorian diseases like rickets coming back because children just don't have the food they should. Anyway, but on mental health, I think it's incredibly important, but I would argue that it needs to be a much more fundamental rethink about how we think about education. So we need to build resilience in children. We need to give them the tools so they don't reach crisis point. So obviously we need to now deal with the crisis because we are in an emergency, but you're never going to cancel your way out of that crisis. So we need to give children the tools they need to sort of deal with difficult things that happen in life. I mean, the kids I met, it's an incredible generation. They're not snowflakes. They're really brilliant, you know, optimistic, positive, dynamic, determined, all of that. And I don't think you do it through sort of happiness classes. It's things like actually sport, drama, things that encourage social interaction, teamwork. You know, it's giving people a sense of agency over their lives. I went to
Stoicism? Teaching people to be more stoic about that.
Well, I think you do that through perhaps you might lose some of your sports, but you know, we've got the amount of PE that kids are doing has dropped off a cliff. That's Bedford Free School is brilliant at this. I went to California and I spoke to Sal Khan, who runs the Khan Academy, which is this amazing online resource, 30 million people. And he said he thinks perhaps one of the reasons that the systems, that there is so much mental health problems among the young, is that we've created this sort of sense of learned helplessness among children, because they're passive learners. They're sitting there having to remember facts and fill in, you know, basically tick boxes to get through their exams. And he thinks if we could give more of a sense of sort of agency over how and what they learn, obviously they need to learn still the basics, but sort of somehow empower children and respect children, not in a wishy-washy way, but in a way that builds genuine resilience, independence of thought. I think there's a sort of more profound thing.
Do you worry slightly that we sometimes leave people with the impression that it's all someone else's fault? That actually, what you're saying about a sense of agency, that I think Michael Gove said he wanted everybody to be the author of their own life stories,
Yes.
right? That sense of agency, and actually I worry slightly that we both infantilize, but also say it's all other, the reason it's not working for you is all for things outside of your control.
But you have to give some people, it is out of their control, that's the problem. If they they can't eat, or they don't have anywhere to live, so you have to give them the tools, you can't blame them.
I mean, I'd agree with your point in general, but and things have improved a lot since 2010, but the pandemic has knocked the system sideways. And now there are many people who face forces that are outside of their control, temporarily, but it needs government to put their arms around them, whoever that is, and fix it. And then the system can continue in the way it was.
Thank you.
I
And
think
listen, I'm aware of the time, so I'm afraid we're not going to take any more questions, though you can probably grab our speakers afterwards. I just want to finish with a quick show of hands, ever the teacher. There's going to be 3 options here, okay? Is it going to get better? Is it going to stay the same? Or is it going to get worse? When you think about the prospects for our young people over the next 5, 10 years, I'm going to ask you hands up if you think it's going to get better for them. Hands up if you think it's going to stay the same. Hands up if you're worried it's going to get worse. Okay. Well, on that bombshell, just a couple of things to say. First of all, thank you so much for coming. Can we just show appreciation to our guests for coming up today? Thank you. If you haven't yet already done so, please subscribe to the CapEx and the CPS newsletter, and then Alice won't beat me up. Secondly, we've got another great talk in here at 12:30 about how do we make energy cheaper. I, for one, am very excited about that. If you've got any questions and you want to grab our speakers, please do, but thank you again for coming.